So many people say that you need a fast lens to take great portraits, and something like this 24-105 f4 isn't really a portrait lens at all, but I disagree. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about why I actually really like this lens for portraits, and also go over a couple of really easy, simple tips how you can get the most out of your portraits when shooting with slower lenses like this. Okay, so first up, why do I like a 24-105 f4 for portraits? What are its strengths? Well, primarily, it's definitely its range. It has almost every one of my favorite focal lengths for portraits, all in a single lens. So you can put together really dynamic sets of portraits, everything from wide full body shots at wider focal lengths like 24, 28 or 35, through to very flattering portraits at 85 or 105mm and everything in between. And yeah, this RF 24-105 is small, it's fast focusing, it's sharp, it has image stabilization, and also it might be the perfect lens in the studio. It is a total workhorse lens. Also, this is a fast lens. Not talking about its aperture, but if you are on a busy set or photo shoot, being able to get such a wide variety of different shots all in a single lens without having to stop and go swap out prime lens for a different focal length, for example, is a very underrated benefit. But the primary reason I think so many people seem to underestimate this lens is because of that max f4 aperture, which yeah, for a lot of people is on the slow end for a portrait lens at least, and I think a lot of people seem to associate this lens with kind of flat, boring portraits without much background blur or separation. So how do we work around that? Well, here is how I make the most out of this lens for portraits, or really any slower lens, and how you can really easily add depth without having to rely on aperture. Okay, so first up, there are actually a few ways that you can separate your subject from the background. So first up, let's talk about creating physical separation. So you might find a background with a really nice color or texture, but with an f4 lens, placing your subject right against it isn't really giving the lens much chance at all to soften or blur that background. So here, for example, I ask Jade to step forward just a few steps, just over a meter or so, or something like that. And straight away, look how much we softened that background. Even a small amount of space can make a huge difference. If you're tight on space, move your model as far away from the background as you can, and then use the longer end of the zoom to just kind of isolate little pockets of interesting texture and turn them into a backdrop for tighter portraits like this. Now let's talk about tonal separation. Another simple way to add depth and separation is to naturally increase the contrast in a scene. So basically, bright subject, dark background. So right here, this is actually a busy, tricky scene, but I positioned Jade in this little pocket of light, and her brighter outfit and skin tone already separate her from the darker background, but this pop of light does make a huge difference. And now you can actually exaggerate this slightly in post too, so just mask the background, pull the exposure down a little bit, even by just this much, and also maybe brighten the face a little bit. So in my preset pack, just click Portrait Pop and Face Enhance, and yeah, in 2 clicks, I've darkened the background and brightened my subject. And I do this on every portrait, so making your own preset for functions like this can really, really help. And if you've got my preset pack and you're wondering, then 90% of these photos are all edited with either Santos or my Monaco preset. But yeah, our eyes are just naturally drawn towards brighter areas and contrast. So you're basically using light rather than aperture to direct attention towards your subject. So yeah, look out for those little pockets of light when you arrive at a scene. And here's another example. So Jade is against a much darker background again, but I've positioned her so this little pocket of light catches her hair. And that edge light around her hair helps separate her, even though we've got her dark hair against a dark background. And again, I'll often enhance that just very slightly in post as well by brushing over that hairlight and just brightening it up a little bit. So yeah, really simple stuff, but it's easy to forget on a shoot. I would say before you start worrying about aperture, just pay attention to your background, your subject's distance from the background, and also where is the light falling. You can create loads of separation without changing your aperture at all. Now let's look at zooming out and really utilizing the range that you get with a 24-105. And first up, make sure you actually take advantage of having 105mm. It's one of my absolute favorite focal lengths. They're really flattering headshots. Even when you're in an amazing location and yeah, obviously you want to show some of it off, it is easy to forget those tighter, more intimate portraits and headshots. But 105mm is not just for headshots. If you find yourself struggling to get enough depth or background separation, try using those longer focal lengths like 85, like 105, for your mid-length and even full-length portraits. It is really easy to go into a kind of autopilot and shoot a full-length portrait at say 28, 35, or 40, like these shots, which I do like, by the way, but if you step back and shoot that same full-length composition at 105mm, you get a completely different look. You're narrowing your field of view, bringing much less of the background into the frame, and even at f4 you can get loads of background blur doing this. So yeah, take a look at these shots that are first of all shot at more conventional, wider focal lengths for these kind of crops, and then what I'm going to do is match the composition at 105mm and take the shot again. And look at the difference in the background and the overall separation in the image that you get when doing this. If you're chasing more separation, don't think of 105mm as just a headshot focal length. Try stepping back and using it for full length and mid-length portraits as well. Something else I'd recommend with a zoom like this is actually treating it more like a set of prime lenses. So rather than just kind of standing in one spot and twisting the zoom ring, I like to pick a certain focal length, maybe 35, 50, 85, 105, stay locked at that focal length, and then move around with my feet to find different compositions. Basically, treat each focal length in the zoom like you've just put on a different prime lens. I find that stops me getting lazy with a zoom and usually gives me much more varied sets of images. And finally, those longer focal lengths can be an absolute cheat code for getting rid of distractions. So yeah, take this shot. Now I actually really like the light and the composition, but this building on the right doesn't really add anything to the shot, and honestly, it's just kind of ugly. So instead, I step back, zoom in to 105mm, and create basically the same framing, and now the building is completely gone. That narrower field of view lets me isolate a much smaller part of the background, and suddenly I've got a much cleaner image that's completely focused on Jade. Same with this shot, so there's an awful lot going on here. It's a very messy scene. Stepping back and zooming in really simplifies it and eliminates distractions. So if you're shooting somewhere busy, or honestly maybe somewhere that just isn't particularly photogenic, the long end of a 24-105 can be so useful for simplifying the scene. Guys, before we continue, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, and I think having a website as a photographer is a must, and it just doesn't get any easier than Squarespace. There's no coding or design skills needed. It's mostly just drag and drop. And now Squarespace even have amazing AI tools like Design Intelligence or Blueprint AI, all of which can help you create your own personalized website in just a few super simple steps. And of course, the fully customizable photo galleries I think are just perfect for showing off your portfolio to potential clients. Squarespace also has fantastic e-commerce tools that make setting up your own online store so easy, and it means you can start selling in no time. And as well as that, you can handle many different payment types seamlessly, all thanks to Squarespace payments. Okay, so if you are ready to get started, head on over to squarespace.com/JamesReader to sign up for a 14-day trial. And you can also use the code JamesReader for 10% off your first domain or website. This next tip is all about composition, because good composition can actually do a lot of work that we normally rely on a fast aperture to do for us. Basically, if we use the environment to tell the viewer exactly where to look, we don't necessarily need to blur that environment away. First up, look for leading lines. Basically, anything within a scene that creates a natural line through the image and guides our eye towards our subject. So look at this photo. These windows actually take up the majority of the frame, and Jade is actually relatively small within our shot, but still our eyes go straight towards her. By positioning her here, all of these lines naturally lead towards Jade. They give our eyes a path through the image and make it really obvious where we should be looking. And because those lines run through the scene towards our subject, they can also add a really nice sense of depth as well. Framing works in a very similar way. So doorways, windows, trees, plants, basically anything you can place around your subject to create a natural frame. Take this shot, there's actually quite a lot going on in the background, but this doorway creates a really obvious frame around Jade. And again, it visually tells us what's important in the image and immediately draws our attention towards her. And these elements can add depth as well, because rather than just having our subject against a flat background, we can have the frame in the foreground, our subject, and then another layer behind our subject. And you can combine all of this as well. So here I positioned Jade so these lines, along the wall lead directly towards her, whilst the doorway itself creates a frame around her. Everything in this composition is basically working together to point towards the same place, our subject. And here's an example where I'm throwing pretty much everything and the kitchen sink at this. So there's multiple frames, there's leading lines, there's layers, and I'm using the longer end of the lens as well, using 105mm. It's a really busy scene, loads of intersecting lines and distractions, but because all of these compositional elements are working around Jade, she still feels like the obvious subject. And yeah, I think that's the bigger thing to look for. So when I arrive at a location, I'm not just looking for a nice background and then just putting my model in front of it and taking a shot. I'm looking at the whole scene and kind of asking, where does my subject naturally fit within all of this? Look at the lines, the shapes, frames and layers that are already there at the scene, and try moving your subject around until it feels like those elements are working with your subject rather than competing against them. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of portrait photography, or just photography in general, finding where someone fits within a scene and then building the composition around them. And yet again, we've created depth, separation, and a really obvious subject without having to rely on a super shallow depth of field at all. The next tip is all about using out of focus elements in the foreground of your shot. So yeah, adding things like flowers, plants, grass, honestly anything close to the lens can add a surprising amount of depth to a portrait. And even at slower apertures like f4, if something is close enough to the lens like this, it can still become very heavily blurred. What I like about this is that instead of just having our subject and a background, now we have three really obvious layers in the shot. We've got a foreground, we've got a subject, and we've got a background, which helps give the image that feeling of depth and 3D space. And you can use that foreground quite deliberately too. So sometimes you can use it again to frame your subject, maybe use it to cover something distracting, maybe at the edge of the frame, or maybe just add some color or create a kind of softer, dreamier look. Once you've found something that works, just move the camera around slightly, try different angles, and watch how that foreground blur moves through the frame. Sometimes a really small change in your position can completely change the composition. This is one of my favorite techniques because it's so simple, but it can add so much depth and dreaminess to a portrait. And again, we don't need f1.4 to do it. So I do have a few more tips for you, including one that might be a little bit controversial. But first, if f4 really is the problem, let's see exactly what we're missing compared to a faster lens. So now we're going to see what you actually are missing out on with a slower lens like this. So I'm going to compare the 25 to 105 f4 to the 24 to 72.8 to the RF 51.8, so like a relatively cheap prime, and then my absolute favorite, the RF 50mm f1.2, just to see, you know, when you really are in those tricky situations, how much a super fast aperture can make a difference to a portrait. So here is basically the same portrait taken on a range of lenses with an increasingly wider aperture, and we're at 50mm here, so kind of a middle of the pack focal length. Comparing f4 to 2.8, honestly in this particular scene, I think the difference is pretty small. It's not really until we get to f1.8 that the difference becomes immediately obvious to me. And at f1.8 and especially f1.2, we are really smoothing out everything around our subject. So even without using any of the lighting or composition techniques that we've talked about in this video, the lens is kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And yeah, that's definitely the advantage of a really fast prime. You know, something like this 51.2 can give you that dreamy look incredibly easily. And in a busy or less than ideal location, it can honestly be a little bit of a cheat code. But speaking of cheat codes, these days, if you do want more blur, you can pretty much just cheat. Lightroom and programs like Luminar Neo can add pretty convincing background blur to a portrait with basically one click. Especially if you're subtle with it. Now, honestly, I never really use this tool. I kind of just forget it exists, but I really want to see how far we can actually push it. So can we make our f4 lens look like an f1.2 prime? So first up, using Lightroom, here's how much lens blur I had to add, I think, to more or less match our real, genuine f2.8 image. And honestly, it's pretty subtle. I think that looks reasonably convincing. Now, let's try to match f1.8. So obviously now we're adding quite a bit more blur. But just looking at these two images normally, I think they're surprisingly close. It doesn't immediately scream artificial blur to me. Finally, here's how far I had to push it to get our f4 shot somewhere close to the real f1.2 image. And from a distance, you might get away with it, but for sure, once we zoom in, things do start to fall apart. Look at the real f1.2 image. So we get this really nice, smooth, gradual transition from our sharp subject into the softer areas around her. Whereas on the artificial version, Lightroom starts struggling with those transitions. So you can see it cutting around Jade, losing some of the flyaway hairs, and in places we get a much more abrupt jump from sharp to completely blurred, like a cardboard cutout. Now, somebody who's better with this particular tool than me could probably refine this, I'm sure. I've just left it at the default settings. And there are other programs that might do an even better job, like Luminar Neo, I found works really good. But personally, I would never push it anywhere near this far. Where I do think this can be useful, again, if you are using a slower lens, is just adding a really subtle amount of extra blur. If you've got an image where the background is slightly more distracting than you would like and there was just nothing you could do about it, then a small amount can actually look pretty convincing. So no, it's probably not turning our f4 zoom into a 1.2 prime, but it can get us a little bit closer in a pinch. But let me know what you think of a tool like this. Do you see it as cheating, or is it just another tool, and would you use it? All right, so that is it. So hopefully this maybe gave you a few things to try, and also hopefully proves that you don't always need a super fast lens to get great portraits. But let me know what you think. Is something like a 24 to 105 f4 a good portrait lens, or is that maybe a lens that you'd avoid? And also let me know in the comments if you've got any other tips for getting the most out of slower lenses like these. I'd really want to hear from you guys. But that is it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching this one. Really appreciate it. I'll see you all next time.